prevention. So the focus of this next couple of months for me is about giving you some insight into preventing psychological injuries or psychosocial injuries in the workplace. And so in talking about preventing those sorts of injuries at work, we come up with a number of different ideas and things that people often think that we can't prevent injuries, that these are sorts of things that we can't see or understand ahead of time. So I just want, if you are watching live at the moment, if you wouldn't mind putting in the comments below that you are watching live. If there's any questions that you have along the way, please put them in the comments below, because what we'll do is come back and respond to those comments later on. So if there's any questions around the things that I'm about to talk to you about, really important that you take the opportunity to put that in the comments and we will respond. All right, so when we talk about prevention, I've presented at multiple conferences in the last few years, most of them online in the last 2 years, but where I've talked about how we actually prevent psychological injury or PTSD developing. And I'm really excited to be working on a new project that's looking at early intervention treatment when we know that an industry is an area that might lead people to be more prone to developing a psychological injury. So, for example, when we know about emergency responders or first responders or defence personnel, we know that one of the risks for those people is developing PTSD over time because of the number of traumatic experiences that they're exposed to in the work environment. So they're industries that I think a lot of the leaders understand that it's almost just a byproduct of, the work for some people. And I remember having a particular discussion with a very senior person in the emergency services space several years back, and I don't think he'll mind me mentioning it was Andrew Short. He said to me, it's really difficult to understand how you can knowingly send great people who are there just trying to help out the community into a difficult scenario in terms of what they're actually facing, the reality of what they're doing, whether they're fighting a fire or they're having to deal with somebody who's had a pretty horrific car accident or, something like that. Those first responders, how do you as a leader recognize that you're sending them out potentially to something that's going to cause them harm and still be okay with the fact that that's the case? And I think this is one of the challenges that leaders in these sorts of areas have struggled with over time. And, over many years, a lot of them have just kind of gone, oh, well, suck it up, sunshine, you'll get over it. Just get back on the horse. That's something that I hear a lot, that we, even from a leadership perspective, we just encourage people to push it down and pretend it didn't happen. And I think we've also worked out over time that actually doesn't work. It causes more problems. And there's a lot of research coming out of Europe in particular about the benefits of intervening early in the first 6 hours of an exposure to a particularly traumatic event. And a lot of the research stuff that I've done over the past couple of years has been looking at how would certain systems, for example, in defence or in, police training or something like that, ambulance officers, what are the sorts of incidents that we could categorize that we know based on, a certain kind of number of ticking the boxes in terms of the scenario are more likely to cause people to experience a traumatic injury? And so in a defence or an emergency service space, that's actually very easy for us to be able to identify. In a standard workplace, it's not necessarily as easy to identify because we have people who will be exposed to certain work situations that then make them feel really uncomfortable. And you'll notice the last couple of months I've talked to you about the importance of carefully managing change in the environment at work, because poorly managed change is actually the biggest risk for psychosocial injuries. So we know that change can potentially cause a problem, but then we get bullying and harassment claims. We get, some other challenges in terms of the work environment that lead people to develop injuries. And we've seen with COVID that these things have become worse over time, and that there are quite high numbers, especially in the health professions, of people experiencing a psychosocial injury as a result of COVID, because there were lots of things that happened, especially in that health perspective, in the frontline workers, emergency departments in hospitals and those sorts of things, where a lot of the health professions were pressured to actually just be dealing with a lot of the stuff around COVID and not feeling that they were able to manage their own exposure to something that was, potentially life-threatening for them as well. So they're not easy questions or areas to discuss, but I think that it's really important to start talking about the fact that there are things that we can do to try and help prevent the psychological injury developing. And a lot of it too is about the early intervention. So I talk to a lot of organisations about what is the process around somebody who reports a bullying or harassment case, that how do we manage to keep them in the work environment? And a big part of that is about, if it's not working in the particular work area where they may have an issue, then rather than just allowing them to be off work on long-term stress leave, and that will ultimately lead to them submitting a workers' compensation claim, that how do we provide an alternative work environment that will support them to actually then come back to work and be able to recover at work? And I think this is an important one, right? It's a really big area that I think we often just don't touch on. We kind of don't recognise that if we intervened early and we just gave a person the benefit of the doubt and we gave them an alternative place to turn up and work, that what we're actually giving them is an opportunity to feel valued and supported by the organisation. Now, your business may not be big enough to be able to take that on. If somebody had an issue with you directly as the business owner and there are only, a dozen people in your organisation, well, you're probably not going to be able to do that without resolving the problem. But I also expect that in a smaller organisation, the problem's not as likely to develop to such an extent before that person would have, put their hand up and said that it was a problem, right? So a lot of this is really interesting in terms of it can be quite subjective, but it makes a whole lot of sense that if there's somebody who's reporting that they've got an issue, and, it's quite reasonable that the issue is something that for whatever reason they can't resolve, either being in that team or at that work environment, what options do we have for them to be able to continue to make a contribution of whatever, form they can? And I think back to something that happened to me personally many years ago when I was still a public servant, where, for a range of different reasons, I felt sandwiched in between a couple of people in a work scenario and, targeted for a reason that still doesn't really make clear sense to me. And when I was unable to kind of still be working in that particular work environment, I had another contact who was able to find me a position in another team where I could, in essence, really sit and lick my wounds and try and work out what had happened and what contribution I might have made to any problems that potentially had formed in that work area, and get clear about what was my responsibility, what were other people's responsibilities. But I was given the opportunity to still turn up to work every day, make a contribution in whatever way I could, until I had recovered enough in my confidence to enable me to, be able to potentially then go and apply for other positions or move elsewhere, or, stay working in the area that I'd moved into. And we find this a lot. I spent last week up at Quest in Bundanoon, and the Quest for Life program, just in case you've never seen it, questforlife.org. It's interesting. I think it's even .au, but anyway, they had the Moving Beyond Trauma program. And I think one of the things about that, Patria King actually states that the reason she set up Quest for Life was because when she got sick, in her case, she got sick with cancer, but she was given a space to recover. that somebody gave her a place that she could essentially find rest until she could kind of, recover from the impact of the cancer and work through the, traumatic events that have been associated around it. And I think if we can do that in a work environment as well, then it makes it a whole lot easier for everybody. Now, a lot of organisations say to me, but Kerry, it's resource intensive. We don't have time to manage those people and whatever. But it actually costs the organisation a lot more to let that person go off on leave and make a workers' compensation claim in the time that it takes to try and get them back to work than it is if they just sort of had an alternative intervention pathway that happened from the beginning. And so I would encourage you to just have a bit of a look at what the standard process is if somebody's got a problem. Bigger organisations 10 years ago, we used to have things like harassment contact officers. Well, if somebody's reaching out to a harassment contact officer, they obviously feel like they need support. Should that then be a flag that means that the organisation automatically involves them in an alternative process to ensure that we nip the problem in the bud before that person ends up going out on long-term stress leave or ending up in a workers' compensation claim? The claims themselves end up costing you a lot in terms of resources, and so it's really much more beneficial to everybody to have an alternative pathway, and that would involve external mediation. And I would encourage you to actually have a look at putting into place some standard mediation processes when there are issues in the work environment, because in reality it's not meant to be all one way or the other or perfect, but we just can think ahead of time about, well, how might we be able to resolve this for the benefit of all involved? It's not about trying to lay blame. It's often about a misunderstanding or miscommunication. All right. So I hope that was useful. Please, if there's anything that you want to know a bit more about, type that into the comments below. And just remembering the next couple of months, I will be focusing on this very important issue of prevention, and I will see you soon.